One of the fun things that's going to come out over the next, sort of couple of years with reform in charge in a couple of these councils is that you are actually going to get people like who know what they're talking about, people who have been in those positions or who are in those positions who are just going to turn around and just going to go, not how that works, not how that works at all. Or if you do that, there are going to be these consequences. How are you going to deal with those consequences? That's why I'm looking forward to whatever I think it's the Wolf report that Kimmy Badnock's announced, how the UK is going to leave the European Court of Human Rights. Okay. Totally not biased at all, right? Anyway, yeah, back to reform. Anyway, it's been very clear, especially over some of the other stuff, especially when they've been talking about Kent, especially when they've been talking about this DOGE unit stuff. Oh, yeah, by the way, Zia Yusuf now rejoined Reform UK. However, he hasn't come back as chairman. He's taking over the DOGE unit. So something's clearly gone on there, because why is he not going back as chairman? Again, mysteries abound. And what has, shall we say, been agreed for him to come back? Anyway, interesting questions. I'm sure we will get the answers to eventually, maybe at some point in the future. However, back, of course, to our usual topic of reform hasn't got a single clue how government spending works in this case, which is what we're talking about. Because, oh boy, again, for a party that ran on, they are going to cut all the waste, fraud, and abuse in these local councils, but then have absolutely no idea how government spending works. Oh, that looks like it is going to be a disaster waiting to happen. Anyway, before we do get on into this, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button down below. Of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the YouTube membership button down below as well. So thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. And of course, as always, there you can hit the like and share button as well. And if you are new, click the subscribe button as well. So let's crack on then into this. Coming from the East Anglia bylines. With exposed, Reform UK doesn't know how government spending works. So, public procurement isn't sexy. I worked with it tangentially with my day job, and when I needed to procure a digital service or product, hello G Cloud 14, I always relied on a procurement service to now guide me through it. This isn't, of course, an accident. Procurement is deliberately obscure and technical. It is meant to be. It is the Brussels sprouts of government administration, nutritionally sensible and utterly unglamorous, and guaranteed to make people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties. Most members of the public don't understand how it works, and that's not their failing. It is simply how boring, cut, crucial parts of the government actually work, like knowing the difference between statutory instruments and, again, primary legislation, or understanding why council meetings follow those very peculiar procedural rituals that make PMQs look like a casual chat. Like I say, the inner workings of councils mystify, honestly, most people. Even me, when I'm looking at all this type of stuff, you wonder what on earth is going on there. And then you realize that there's like this backstory, and this backstory's got backstory, and this backstory's got backstory of the backstory. And by that point, you're honestly like, where was I about this? Where was this all going? What? Anyway, so, but when politicians, of course, don't understand procurement and, of course, try to weaponize it for scandal, we, of course, have a problem. And Reform UK have just given us a masterclass in how not to read a government contract. So before we dive into Reform UK's spectacular misunderstanding, let us establish, of course, what public procurement actually means. At its core, it is how public bodies buy things, services, goods, and consultancy. But unlike popping to Tesco for your weekly shop, public procurement operates under very strict rules, designed to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for money. Again, all these things that Reform UK claim doesn't happen in councils, but it does. They just don't care about it, or just think that it doesn't happen at all, which is, trust me, going to lead to some very fun encounters in the future, that's for sure. Anyway, think of it this way. Imagine now you're organizing a catering for events over the next 4 years, and rather than again phoning around for quotes every time you need sandwiches, you create an approved list of caterers who've already been vetted and agreed to your terms. Being on that list does not guarantee any work, it just means that they are pre approved to bid when you actually need something. The framework value might be at least 2 million for over 4 years. That's, of course, a theoretical maximum. If you need the most expensive caterer now for the priciest options at every single event, in reality, you'd spend a fraction of that, and you might not even use some caterers at all. This is how, of course, G Cloud works for digital services. It is a framework worth billions, but that doesn't mean that the government is now writing checks for billions. It is approving suppliers that can now bid for work as it comes up with pre-arranged terms. The framework ceiling prevents any single supplier from, of course, hoovering up everything, though that doesn't guarantee anyone a payday. The framework, of course, exists because the alternative would be bureaucratic madness, running a full tender process every time you need a temporal social worker, the interim finance director, or even a new IT system. They save time, they save money, and administrative effort while trying to maintain competitive processes and transparency requirements. So now we know how council procurement works. And now let's watch how Reform UK completely misunderstand all of this. Which brings us round to Reform UK. The now former and now back in Reform UK, although again not the chairman, Zia Yusuf, on social media outburst, of course, about Kent County Councils, is now in breathless tones. He declared that Kent has now tendered a contract for recruitment services for around 350 million for 4 years. That would represent a staggering 22% of their annual payroll. The key implication was scandal, waste, and a racket. Except it isn't a contract. It is a framework, and it is just for Kent. It is a national framework, and any public body in the UK can access NHS trusts, other councils, schools, civil service, arm's length bodies, the lot. Kent simply hosted the procurement, rather like hosting a buffet where everyone is invited, but you still get blamed when someone complains about the vol au vents. The 350 million, of course, isn't money, of course, being spent. It is the maximum theoretical value across all participating organizations for 4 years. It is a ceiling, not a spend. It is the maximum procurement equivalent in seeing, again, a restaurant's maximum occupancy of being 200 people. The sign, of course, is assuming that they've already sold 200 dinners and that evening, and that the services, again, weren't just advertising vacancies and interviewing people, as Yusuf characterizes them, but now a comprehensive talent sourcing, everything from executive searches to compliance, payroll, specialist recruitment across all different sectors from social care to IT. Most tellingly, of course, was Yusuf's calculation that represent something of 22% of Kent's payroll. That only made sense, of course, if you assumed that Kent was now personally spending the entire £350 million themselves, which, of course, they weren't, but because it was a framework, not an invoice. So, why does this all matter? Now, you might think, so what? Politicians misunderstanding technical details all the time. Absolutely fair enough. But this particular misunderstanding reveals something rather more troubling about reform's readiness for government. Public procurement isn't something of an arcane corner of administration that politicians can just afford to ignore. It is how government actually works for the day to day. And this is the big thing, because every day politicians, government works. Just do day to day how it all works. And public procurement, as you just said there, make sure that if they need something, they can go get it. They're not having to go through a full, complete tender process, which would cost probably even more money to do so. Now, I think, and a lot of people have been raising this, will we see Reform UK try and break the system in some way? I think they might try and break it in some way. And I think when they break it, it will be spectacular. I think this will come out with lots of scandals that, they started handing lots of very lucrative contracts to their friends. Anyway, but back to this. Every, of course, major policy initiative, every infrastructure project, every attempt now to deliver services relies on procurement processes. Again, exactly as we said, day-to-day workings of government. If you cannot, of course, distinguish between a framework and a contract, between a spending ceiling and an actual expenditure, how are you planning to actually manage departmental budgets? Which is, again, oh boy, next year, when we start to see them try to talk about budgets, that's going to be interesting. That's going to be very interesting indeed. How will then they oversee major infrastructure projects? How will you avoid the kind of procurement disasters that plagued the early COVID response that ended up costing the country 1.4 billion? Again, very good example. And no, I'm not expecting politicians to become procurement experts. I'm expecting them to actually grasp the fundamentals before launching public attacks on supposedly scandalous spending. It is about recognizing when you need to ask an expert rather than reaching straight for the outrage button. If you can't tell the difference between a budget ceiling and an actual check, perhaps stick to commenting on Love Island rather than fiscal policy. Again, good barb on that one. Private companies, of course, incidentally, also operate near identical systems. Major corporations also maintain approved supplier lists, framework agreements, and again, multi-year contracts with spending ceilings. They do this because it works, because the alternative now of starting from scratch every single time you need something is inefficient, expensive, and risky. And now, of course, along comes the DOGE panel. This whole exercise, of course, on outrage is now based on misunderstandings now of the basics. And it becomes even more concerning when you consider the fact that Reform has now launched its own Department of Government Efficiency, a direct copy of the Trump administration's DOGE initiative. The original DOGE, despite its social media bluster and grand promises, is fast becoming a cautionary tale about making performative outrage for actual governance. While it, of course, very loudly pledged to save trillions, it actually ended up losing more money than it saves through workplace chaos, the rehiring costs, and now the avoidable litigation. Its procurement approach is providing particular disastrous, slashing expertise, bypassing established processes, and treating every contract as fraudulent until proven innocent. And oh boy, is the same thing going to happen here. The outcome, of course, was pure unbridled chaos, wasted money, and the systems that collapse exactly when people actually need them most. Again, example we always give when this comes up. There's just been a big hurricane season or tornado season in America, right? DOGE got rid of some of the alarms that warn people about those. What do you think happened during this particular season? Not hard to figure out what happened. So leaders, of course, dismiss this expertise as bureaucracy. They brand the establishment processes as waste and treat the complex systems like elaborate scams for wasting more common sense and a chainsaw now to try and expose them. Sound very familiar. Now, I would, of course, hasten to add at this point that genuine procurement scandals, of course, do exist. Again, they do exist. This is why, I will always say, yes, there are, of course, councillors that have gone on the take. There are, of course, bad ones, but to say that, like, absolutely every single council is like rotten to the core, that they're all on the take, that they're all corrupt as they come, is not the case, because we just do not see that. We just do not see that. But if you go on any local news site or Facebook page that you might know, look what happens when a local council gets brought up. Oh, how corrupt they are. Oh, councillor so and so yet again on the take. Anyway, back to this. So I would obviously hand the procurement do exist, but they do look absolutely nothing like, of course, reform's manufactured outrage over the framework ceilings. Rather, real scandal involved now rigged competitions, insider dealing, desperate exclusion now of competitors, or even contracts awarded to companies with no relevant experience, but excellent political connections. They provide process manipulation, not process misunderstanding. The COVID VIP lane was a procurement scandal, not because of the contracts had high theatrical values, but because the proper competitive processes were completely bypassed in favor of political connected firms. I guarantee you this is what we could see happen. I think this is what these procurement scandals are going to be. You are going to see the competitiveness bypassed. They're going to be rigged, potential insider dealing. People who get the companies who get these contracts will have no relevant experience, just really good political connections. I guarantee you these are some of the procurement scandals under these reform councils we are going to see. Test and Trace was, of course, a procurement disaster, not because of its framework structure, but because billions were spent on systems that didn't work while alternatives were ignored. Again, another really good recent example. These, of course, cases required very detailed investigation, understanding, of course, how procurement should work, and then very careful analysis of what actually went wrong. They, of course, weren't spotted by people scrolling through the contract notices, looking for big numbers to get angry about. And then this is it, the boring truth about governing. So here's what reform, of course, doesn't seem to grasp. Governing is now mostly about doing mundane things well. It is about understanding how these systems actually work before you try and fix them. It is about recognizing that complexity often serves real purposes, even when that purposes aren't obvious now to outsiders. Yes, government has waste. Yes, some contracts are poorly managed. Some frameworks are badly designed. Some procurement processes are generally scandalous. But spotting real problems requires the understanding of how these things should work. And that means you need now a separate genuine to separate genuine waste from the processes that simply look too expensive to people who do not grasp the process. That I think is going to happen as well. That is absolutely true. I do not think they understand the process from what the purpose is of it. I really do. That is something that really does come across in all this. Reform, of course, is going to treat governing like an aggressive Dragon's Den episode. It is all going to be dramatic gestures and I'm out moments with far less due diligence. Most, of course, government work happens in very unglamorous spaces: procurement frameworks, statutory instruments, interdepartmental cooperation, technical consultations. And when you assume every framework is corrupt, every technical process is wasteful bureaucracy, and every expert opinion somehow shows establishment bias, you break systems you do not understand while trying to solve problems that don't exist. And that ultimately is going to be the big problem, that they are going to try and solve problems that just do not exist. And while, yes, it's already been pointed out, there are problems, but to understand those problems and why it went wrong, you need to understand the systems, how they are meant to work, and then you look at that system and how that went wrong in that system. Otherwise, you're just taking a hammer to a machine and just saying, look, I'm fixing it, while just repeatedly hitting it in the hopes something happens. In the reality, the machine is probably going to break. So, the most, of course, troubling part about reform's procurement scandal that wasn't is, of course, the misunderstanding itself. It is how confidently they, of course, announced it. No pause to at least consult experts. No apparent awareness that they might be missing something crucial. Just a straight line from "this number looks a bit big" to a racket in a single tweet. This is exactly the mindset that breeds government disasters. The conviction that common sense and righteous anger can now be replaced with expertise and careful analysis. The assumption that if something looks wrong to you, it must be wrong, regardless of whether you actually understand what you are looking at. If your flagship efficiency unit is just a meme name lifted from Trump, and maybe you're not ready for number 10, maybe you're even barely ready for basic number crunching. Public procurement might not, of course, trend much on social media, but if you can't tell the difference between a supplier list and a blank check, you have no business being near the corridors of power, let alone running 12 councils. And unfortunately, I think that is what's going to happen here. Like, I really do think that's what's going to happen here, that you are going to see some procurement scandals just come along from these reform councils because they just didn't know how it worked. They tried to fix something that was working. They just didn't understand how it works, so they broke the system even more. Hence, it's going to lead to probably some quite big procurement scandals. And ultimately, it's going to be because of DOGE. Like I say, I am looking forward to whatever like these DOGE guys come up with. Because I'll tell you now, it is going to be ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And it's just going to be scandal upon disaster upon bad governance. And the thing is, bad governance leads to some very, very bad outcomes down the road. That's for sure. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.